From the earlier cassette on material chess, you learned that having more material is the most straightforward way of gaining the upper hand. We learned how to make and spot attacks, and how to defend against them. However, the drawback of the single attack is that it can always be defended against if you're alert enough, which is admittedly a big if for a beginner. Nonetheless, even without any material errors, it's still possible to win and lose pieces suddenly on the chessboard. This is because of tactics, and tactics, in essence, is the multiple attack, which sets your opponent more than one problem to solve with only one move. On this tape we shall learn all about the double or multiple attack, and at the end of the tape we shall look at the chess sacrifice, which is perhaps the most scintillating and breathtaking area of chess play, where material is offered up for a higher goal.
The fork. The most simple double attack is the fork, which occurs when one of your pieces or pawns attacks two or more of your opponent's men at the same time. This leaves your opponent with the problem of meeting both of your threats with just one move. Let's look at an example. Clear your board of pieces. Place a black knight on d6, a black rook on f6, and a white pawn on e5. The pawn attacks both the knight and the rook. If black moves either of the pieces, white will capture the piece that hasn't moved and will therefore win material. Again, clear your board, place two black pawns, one on e5 and one on a5, and a white rook on b5. The rook attacks both black pawns, and if one moves to safety, the other will be captured. To show that you understand the fork, leave the two black pawns on e5 and a5, remove the white rook, and after turning off the cassette, decide on all the possible squares on which the white queen could stand, so that it forks the two black pawns. The important thing to remember is that the queen must attack both the pawns at the same time. We know the queen can move on files, ranks, and diagonals, and with some thought you should have found the following forking squares: A1, E1, C3, C7, B5, C5, and D5. On E1 and A1, the queen attacks one pawn along a file and one on a diagonal. On C3 and C7, both pawns are threatened along a diagonal. And on C5, B5, and D5, the queen attacks both pawns along the fifth rank. The knight, of course, has a unique way of forking that no other piece or pawn can copy. Take the example of the two black pawns on E5 and A5 again. After turning off the cassette, decide whether a white knight can fork these two pawns, and if so, on what squares it can do so. The knight can fork the two pawns if it is placed on C6 or C4. Although the fork involves the powerful weapon of a double attack, it is not effective if the piece that does the forking is more valuable than the men being forked, and these men are protected. A simple example will show you what I mean. After turning off the cassette, set up the initial position on your board. White starts with E2, to e4, and black replies e7 to e5. Now suppose white plays queen d1 to h5, so that it forks the three black pawns on f7, h7, and e5. Certainly the queen does attack the three black pawns, but the queen won't capture the pawns on f7 or h7 because they are protected by the black king and black rook. Thus the queen is really only threatening the black pawn on e5, which is easily protected by the move knight b8 to c6. This shows us that for an attack to be a threat, the attacker must be prepared to trade itself for the man that it is attacking. The values of the various men involved in a fork are therefore important to how effective the fork is. The best forks are when the forked men are unprotected, or when the forking man is worth less than the forked men. In both these cases, the forking man threatens to capture both of the enemy men and win material. Let us now look at how you can defend against a fork, just as we did with the single attack in the cassette on material chess. I will use an example to illustrate the various ideas, so after turning off the cassette, set up diagram 1 on your board. You can see that in this position, the white bishop on d4 forks the black rook on e5 and the black pawn on b6. Both of these black men are unprotected, and white threatens to capture both of them. The first defensive idea is to capture the forking piece, as this will remove the double attack altogether. In the example, black could do this by playing rook a4 takes d4, but white would reply e3 takes d4, winning a rook for a bishop. The second idea is to move one of the forked men to protect the other. Black could play rook e5 to e6, thereby protecting the pawn on b6, and at the same time removing the rook from its exposed square. This idea is not of any use if the forking man is worth less than both the forked pieces, as the forking man will capture either of the pieces in the fork if it can. The third idea is to protect both of the forked men with another man. Here black could do so by playing knight b8 to d7, where it protects the rook and the pawn. But white will play bishop d4 takes e5 anyway, winning the exchange. You can no doubt see that this defense is only good when the forking piece is worth more or the same as the forked men. The final idea is to move one of the forked men to create a more powerful threat. This can be done in two ways in our example. By moving the rook from e5 to f5, where it is protected by the knight on e7, the rook attacks the white queen, and once white has moved his queen, black can defend his pawn on b6. This threat by the rook is really just a way of gaining time. An even better way of gaining time is to check the opponent's king, as we know this is the most forcing move on the board. In this example, black can play rook e5 to g5 check, and after the white king has moved, he can defend his pawn on b6. After turning off the cassette, set up diagram 2 on your board and decide whether black can avoid losing material in the knight fork. The white knight on d5 forks the black queen on e7 and the black bishop on b6. Let's look at each of the four ideas I have described. Firstly, black can capture the forking piece by playing rook d8 takes d5, but white would reply bishop g2 takes d5, and black would have lost the exchange. Therefore this is no good. Secondly, the black queen could try to protect the black bishop, but you will notice that it can only do so by moving to c5, c7, or b4, and all these squares are protected by white pieces. Therefore, black cannot protect his bishop with his queen without losing his most powerful piece. Check this for yourself. The third possibility of protecting both the forked men is no use here, as the white knight will capture the black queen if it doesn't move. The fourth idea does, however, give black a way of saving both queen and bishop. Black can play bishop b6 to a5 check, when white must defend his king, giving black the time to move his queen as well. You can see that if the white king had been castled, then black would have had no check with his bishop, and he would have lost material in the fork. Convince yourself of this by castling short for white and looking at the position again. Now turn off the cassette and set up diagram 3 on your board and find a fork for white. Black is vulnerable on the 7th rank, as both his bishops stand on this rank, and neither is protected. White can take advantage of this by playing rook c1 to c7, when the rook forks the two bishops. You can check for yourself that none of the defensive ideas I have shown you can save black from losing material. When the king is one of the forked pieces, a fork can be very dangerous indeed, as the number of defensive options is reduced. Both the third and fourth defensive ideas are not possible if the king is in check. After turning off the cassette, set up diagram 4 on your board and see if you can find a move for black which forks white's king and another piece. White would be fine in this position if he had time to play bishop c1 to b2, but black can exploit white's weakness along the a1 to h8 diagonal by playing queen d8 to d4 check. On d4, the queen forks the white rook on a1 and the white king on g1. White has no time to defend his rook, as his king is more important. Therefore, white loses his rook. Probably the most common fork is the knight fork. The knight seems to have a knack of jumping into the enemy position, causing havoc. Set up diagram 5 on your board and study the position. White has a choice of 2 knight forks in this position. Find these 2 forks and decide whether either of them wins material for white. In other words, find black's best defense each time. White can fork the black king and the black bishop on b7 by playing knight b5 to d6 check, or fork the black king and the black rook on a8 by playing knight b5 to c7 check. The first of these does not win material, as black can capture the knight on d6 by playing bishop e7 takes d6, and white would play queen d1 takes d6. If we do our bookkeeping, we find both sides have lost a piece worth 3 points, and the material is still level. The second fork does win material, however. The knight, once it goes to c7, can only be captured by the black queen, but as the white rook on c1 protects c7, this capture would lose black's queen. I hope you saw the support the rook on c1 gives to the knight. Therefore, after knight b5 to c7 check, black must move his king, and white will capture the rook on a8, thereby winning the exchange. The fork is a powerful tactical weapon. If you learn to use it in your own games, you will not only find yourself winning material, but if you are like me, you will get a lot of enjoyment from finding different ways to use it.
Pins and skewers. The next tactical weapon we shall look at is the pin. What is a pin? A pin is a double attack along a line which immobilizes the front man under attack, because if he moves, the man behind him is going to be captured. To show you what we mean, set up diagram 6 on your board. Turn off your tape while you're doing so.
This position shows you 3 examples of pins. Firstly, the white bishop on b5 pins the black knight on c6 against the black queen on e8. In other words, the knight on c6 cannot move without black losing his queen. The second pin is on the black rook on g7. It too cannot move because the black king would then be in check to the white queen on b2. The third pin is on the white pawn on g2 that protects the white king from attack by the black rook on g7. This pawn can move, as it will still block the attack on the white king, provided it stays on the g-file. However, the pawn is not in a position to capture, as by capturing it would leave the g-file and the white king would be in check. Make sure you understand these 3 pins before continuing. Of what use can the pin be? The main idea behind the pin is to make one of your opponent's men unable to move without losing material, and this can be used in a number of ways. The most straightforward way of taking advantage of a pinned man is to attack it with one of your men which is of less value. As the enemy man cannot move, he is unable to prevent the loss of material that will occur when you capture the pinned man with your less valuable man. After turning off the cassette, set up diagram 7 on your board and see if you can find white's move which takes advantage of a pin in this way. The white bishop on g5 pins the black knight on f6 to the black queen on d8. If this knight moves, black will lose his queen for the bishop, so the knight is stuck on the f6 square. White would like to attack this knight with one of his pawns, and he can do this by playing e4 to e5. The knight cannot move away from this attack, so black must just watch as white captures the knight with his pawn next move, winning material. Another reason for pinning a man is to remove its control of a certain square. In other words, if a man supporting some important square on the board becomes pinned, this man no longer has any control over that square. An example will illustrate this. Set up diagram 8 on your board. If it is white's move in this position, he can play queen d1 takes g4, winning a piece, because the black bishop on e6, that seems to be protecting the knight on g4, is pinned to the black king on e8 by the white rook on e1. The support the bishop gives to the knight is only imaginary because the white rook on e1 prevents the bishop moving. Notice here how absolute a pin against the king is. The bishop on e6 is simply not allowed to move. To show you that each pin has its limitations, swap the black king and black queen around. The bishop on e6 is still pinned by the rook, now against the black queen. However, the move queen d1 takes g4 is no longer any good, as black can simply play bishop e6 takes g4. White will reply rook e1 takes e8 check, and black will play rook h8 takes e8. If we do our bookkeeping, we see black has won the exchange. The important point to remember is that only a pin against the king prevents a man moving completely. Let's look at another example of how a pin removes the control normally possessed by the pinned man. Set up diagram 9 on your board and see if you can take advantage of the pin of the white pawn on g2. First, let's see exactly what the pin of the pawn on g2 by the rook on g8 actually means. The pawn on g2 protects the white king, and so must remain on the g file. Therefore, the pawn no longer has control of the squares f3 and h3, which it would control if it wasn't pinned. Black can use this to achieve a quick checkmate. He plays knight e5 to f3 check. This is the move which has only become possible because of the pin. White cannot capture the knight and must play king g1 to h1. Black finishes the game by playing queen d6 takes h2 checkmate, as it is protected by the knight on f3. The pin is a lovely weapon. Preventing an enemy piece or pawn from moving restricts your opponent's options, so try to use the pin in your own games.
The next aspect of the pin we should discuss is how to defend against it. This can be done in two ways. The first possibility is to break the pin. As the name suggests, by breaking the pinned piece or pawn again becomes able to move. The three examples you have seen in diagrams 7, 8 and 9 can also show you three ways of breaking the pin. So let's set up diagram 7 again on our boards.
If it is black to move instead of white, black can play bishop f8 to e7. Whereas before the white bishop would have captured the black queen if the knight moved, now it will only capture a bishop, and neither side will gain or lose material. This is a common method of breaking the pin. Now set up diagram 8 again on your board, and we will see another method of how to break the pin. If it is black to move here, he can break the pin on his bishop by moving his king off the e-file. This is easily done by castling short. Now the rook no longer pins the bishop against anything, and the bishop performs its normal duty of protecting the knight on g4. Finally, set up diagram 9 on your board once again. The pin on the g-pawn could be broken if white moved his king off the g-file by playing king g1 to h1. But another idea in this position is to play knight e2 to g3. The knight on g3 is well protected by the pawns on h2 and f2, and shields the pawn on g2 so that it is no longer pinned. These three examples have shown you how to break a pin. Now let's look at the second method of defending against the pin, which is to chase away the pinning piece. After turning off the cassette, set up diagram 10 on your board. The white bishop on b5 pins the black knight to the black king. Black decides to do something about the pin before white can take advantage of the immobile knight. He plays a7 to a6, attacking the bishop, and white plays bishop b5 to a4, so that the knight is still pinned. Black now plays b7 to b5, and the bishop is driven away so that the knight is no longer pinned. This is an example of how you can chase away the pinning piece. Although this method is not as common as breaking the pin, it can be very useful at times. Finally, in this section, I would like to discuss the skewer, which is a sort of upside-down pin. In a pin, a less valuable man is pinned to a more valuable one, while in a skewer it is the other way around. Set up diagram 11 on your board and I'll show you an example. White can win material in this position by playing rook a1 to b1, when he skewers the black queen against the black knight on b8. Because the queen is worth more than the rook, black must move his queen. But as you can see, there is no way the queen can move away from the attack by the rook and protect the knight at the same time. Therefore, after a move like queen b5 to a5, white plays rook b1 takes b8 check, winning a knight for nothing. The important element of the skewer is to force the more valuable piece to move, leaving the less valuable piece behind it unprotected. The pin and skewer are both very dangerous weapons, and if you have the opportunity to pin one of your opponent's men, it is usually a good idea to do so, as you never know when you will be able to take advantage of this man that cannot move. Discovered attacks and checks. In the section on forks, we saw a double attack where one man attacked two enemy men. It is also possible to make a double attack using two men to attack the enemy. This is called a discovered attack, and in some ways it is even more effective than the fork. As usual, an example is the best way to illustrate this tactical weapon. After turning off the cassette, set up diagram 12 on your board. In this position, white can make a double attack by playing knight c3 to b5. The knight now attacks the black knight on c7, but more importantly, the white bishop on b2 also attacks the black queen on f6. By moving his knight from c3, White has discovered an attack on the black queen, and so has been able to attack two pieces with just one move. After black moves his queen, white will play knight b5 takes c7, winning a piece, and at the same time forking the two black rooks on a8 and e8. White will win a lot of material. Now set up diagram 13 on your board and see if you can find how black can make a discovered attack on white. This is the end of side 1. With discovered attacks and checks. The first step in making a good discovered attack is to find a single threat that is blocked by one of your own pieces. In this position, we have an ideal one. The black queen on a5 would be attacking the white knight on g5 if the knight on d5 wasn't there. The second step is to find some way of moving the man that blocks this threat so that it too is attacking something. Here black has two choices. He could play knight d5 takes e3, and after f2 takes e3 by white, black can play queen a5 takes g5. After doing your bookkeeping, you see that black has won a pawn. However, black has a much stronger move, so reset diagram 13 on your board, and instead let black play knight d5 to b4. Now the knight attacks the white queen. Once the queen has moved, black will capture the knight on g5, winning a whole piece. Notice that if white's pawn was on e4 instead of on e3, then white could play queen c2 to d2 and protect his knight on g5 at the same time as he saves his queen. A discovered attack, where one of the attacks is against the enemy king, is called a discovered check and is particularly dangerous. Set up the starting position on your board, and I will show you an example. White starts the game with e2 to e4. Black plays e7 to e6. White plays d2 to d4. And black plays d7 to d5. This opening is called the French defense. White now chooses to advance his pawn to e5 and plays e4 to e5. From now on, black tries to attack the white pawn on d4 as much as he possibly can. He starts by playing c7 to c5, and white protects this pawn by playing c2 to c3. Black continues the attack with knight b8 to c6, and white continues to defend with knight g1 to f3. On his fifth move, black plays queen d8 to b6 to attack the d4 square again. White now sets black a little trap by playing bishop f1 to d3. Black, using what he has learnt from the cassette on material chess, calculates that he can win a pawn by capturing on d4, because he has more pieces attacking than White has defending. He plays c5 takes d4. White replies c3 takes d4. Black plays knight c6 takes d4. White plays knight f3 takes d4. And black plays queen b6 takes d4. All seems to have gone according to plan, as black has an extra pawn. But he is in for a shock, as White can play bishop d3 to b5 check, and at the same time discover an attack on the black queen on d4 by the white queen on d1. Black must defend his king first, and this allows White to win the black queen. Isn't that a nice trap? The last point I would like to discuss is the double check. If you make a discovered attack on the enemy king, and at the same time attack the king with the man you have moved, then the enemy king is attacked twice, or is in what we call double check. After turning off the cassette, set up diagram 14 on your board, which is an example of a double check. White has just played bishop e2 to b5 double check. The rook on e1 and the bishop on b5 are both attacking the black king on e8. Why is the double check a devastating weapon? In the first cassette we discussed the three possible defences to a check. They were to move the king, capture the checking man, or block the check. When the king is in double check, he no longer has the last two defences, because only one check can be blocked, or one piece captured at a time. Therefore, the only possible defence is to move the king. You can see in this example the power of the double check in the fact that the black king is actually in checkmate. Check this for yourself by trying all possible moves for black that you can think of. None of them will remove the king completely from check. Remember, the only defense to a double check is to move the king. A piece of advice worth remembering is to be very careful if your opponent places a rook on the same file as your king or queen, or a bishop on the same diagonal. This is exactly the type of situation where a discovered attack can suddenly appear, so it is often worthwhile taking time to move your queen or king off the potentially dangerous file or diagonal. If you have the opportunity to put a piece on the same line as your opponent's queen or king, then do it, as you may get the opportunity to make a discovered attack yourself. Sacrifices. The sacrifice is one of the most exciting possibilities that can occur in a game of chess. A sacrifice is where one player decides to lose material on purpose, but only because he gets some compensation, usually in the form of an exposed enemy king, which he can attack with his pieces. The result of a sacrifice will sometimes be checkmate. Other times the player who has sacrificed material wins the material back, and at other times the sacrifice is unsuccessful, and the player who gave up the material just finds himself with less material and a bad position. Don't get the idea that sacrifices always work and bring about a quick victory, but they are certainly worth using if the opportunity arises. Sacrifices are usually most effective when one player has many more pieces attacking than his opponent has defending. After turning off the cassette, set up diagram 15 on your board. White has a pawn less in this position, but he has some very dangerous threats, especially along the g-file, where we see that his rook on g1 pins the black pawn on g7 against the black king on g8. However, black seems to have things under control, as his well-placed knight on e6 protects the g7 pawn and attacks the white queen at the same time. Watch now how white wins the game quickly by a sacrifice. He starts by playing knight d5 to f6 check. The pin on the g-file allows white to play this move, and black would lose his queen for a knight if he plays queen d8 takes f6, as white would reply queen f4 takes f6, and black would be unable to capture the white queen because of the pin on the pawn on g7. Put the black queen back on d8, the white queen on f4, and the white knight on f6. Instead, black moves his king and plays king g8 to h8, and white seems to be in trouble, because now his knight can be captured by the black pawn on g7, which is no longer pinned, and he doesn't have time to move it, because his queen is still attacked by the black knight. Instead, white plays the amazing move rook g1 takes g7, so that another of his pieces can be captured. This is a sacrifice. Black now has a choice of 3 moves which win material. He can capture the white queen with his knight, or he can capture the rook with his knight or his king. Which should he choose? Let's look at each of these in turn to see why white has sacrificed this material. If black plays knight e6 takes f4, white finishes the game immediately with rook g7 takes h7 checkmate. The knight on f6 has the double duty of protecting the rook once it moves to h7 and also preventing the black king escaping to g8. Now replace the white queen on f4, the white rook on g7, and the black knight on e6, as well as the black pawn on h7. Suppose instead black plays king h8 takes g7. Then white will play rook d1 to g1 check, and the black king must return to the corner of the board, so black plays king g7 to h8. Now white plays queen f4 to h6. This is the reason white sacrificed a rook for the black pawn on g7. It was this pawn that prevented white putting his queen on h6. And now white threatens queen h6 takes h7 checkmate, and black can only stop this by giving up his queen for the white knight. So black plays queen d8, takes f6. White continues with his attack and plays queen h6, takes f6, check. The black king has no square to move to, so he must block the check by playing knight e6 to g7, and white plays queen f6, takes g7, checkmate, because the queen on g7 is supported by the white rook on g1. You can see that both of these two possibilities lead to a quick checkmate. Obviously, white's sacrifice has been a great success. The third move for black, knight e6 takes g7, does not lead to checkmate, but instead white ends up with a material advantage. After knight e6 takes g7, white again plays queen f4 to h6, threatening the familiar checkmate on h7. Black must give up his queen again by playing queen d8 takes f6, and after queen h6 takes f6 by white, white has a queen against black's rook and knight. This should be enough for white to win without much difficulty. Having looked at the possible moves by black, we see that the sacrifice was a total success, winning black's queen for a rook and a knight at the very least. Why was the sacrifice so effective in bringing a quick end to the game? By removing the black pawn on g7, white was able to move his queen to h6 and set up very strong threats of checkmate, which black could only stop by giving up his queen. In other words, the sacrifice was used to weaken the defences around the black king. I would recommend that you look at this example again, playing over the various moves and making sure you understand why black must give up his queen to stop checkmate in the second and third variations. Let's look at another example of a sacrifice that weakens the defences around the king. After turning off the cassette, set up diagram 16 on your board. White is a pawn ahead, but black has some pressure on the B and C files where he has placed his queen and his rooks. But how is he to make an impression on the block of pawns on B3, B2 and C2 that protect the white king? Again, a sacrifice is the key. Black plays rook c8 takes c2. He removes this pawn as it supports the pawn on b3, which blocks the b file. White has a choice of 3 moves. If he captures the rook on c2 with his bishop by playing bishop d3 takes c2, then he has left his queen on a6 undefended, and black can simply play queen b7 takes a6. Now it is black who has a large advantage in material. He has a queen to white's rook. Obviously this is no good for white. The second possibility is to capture the rook with his king by playing king b1 takes c2. Black can now come crashing down the b file by playing queen b7 takes b3 check, and white must play king c2 to d2, because if the king retreats to c1 or b1, black plays queen b3 takes b2 check, and that is checkmate. Against king c2 to d2 by white, black still plays queen b3 takes b2 check. The white king has no retreat, so he must block the check by playing bishop d3 to c2. You can already see that the black pieces are harassing the white king. Black continues his attack on the white king by playing bishop g7 to c3 check, and whether white plays king d2 to d3 or king d2 to e2, black will play bishop d7 to b5 check, forking white's king and queen with his bishop. Again, black finishes with more material, a queen and 2 pawns against rook and bishop. Now reset diagram 16 on your board and again play rook c8 takes c2 for black. White's third possibility is to get rid of the black queen before capturing the rook, so he plays queen a6 takes b7. Before capturing the white queen, black moves his rook to safety by playing rook c2 takes b2 check, where it is protected by the powerful bishop on g7. Because this is check, white must defend his king and cannot think about saving his queen. White plays king b1 to c1. If he had played king b1 to a1, then you can see that black will have the opportunity of playing a powerful discovered check later in the game, because the bishop on g7 will attack the white king on a1. After king b1 to c1 by white, black plays rook b8 takes b7. Now it is black who has an extra pawn, and the rook on b2 is forking 2 more, one on h2 and one on b3. White chooses to protect the pawn on b3 and plays bishop d3 to c4. Black, however, decides not to capture the pawn on h2 immediately, but plays bishop d7 to f5. This bishop now gives black more control of the squares around the white king, and black threatens rook b2 to c2 check, forcing the white king to return to b1, when black will have a powerful discovered check. This third possibility for white of capturing the black queen is what actually happened in the game from which this example was taken, and after bishop d7 to b5, white resigned the game. As with the last example, I would suggest you spend some time looking at this sacrifice again and convincing yourself black gains an advantage no matter what white plays. Studying a position like this will teach you a great deal about how you should attack your opponent's king. I hope these 2 illustrations of the sacrifice have shown you the exciting attacking possibilities that can arise from a well-judged sacrifice, and how some of the tactical weapons I have taught you also play a part in attacking the enemy king. To play a sacrifice in your own games demands a certain amount of courage, but I advise you to be always alert to the possibility of giving up material to gain a powerful attack against your opponent's king. Sometimes the sacrifice of a pawn is all you need. Other times you must give up your queen to achieve a checkmate. Combinations and checkmates. It is certainly not possible to confine combinations to this section alone, because we have been looking at combinations in all the examples since the first cassette. A combination is simply a series of moves that lead to a certain desired end. Both the sacrifices in the previous section were combinations, as the player who sacrificed the material forced a series of moves that led to his advantage. Here I would like to look at some combinations that lead to checkmate. You may well ask, how am I going to be able to see combinations and sacrifices in my own games that lead to checkmate? They seem so complicated. One way of making this task easier is to learn and understand a couple of common checkmates that can occur in your own games. If you are aware of these checkmates, you are much more likely to be able to use them. I will show you two such checkmates. The first is known as the back rank mate. After turning off the cassette, set up diagram 17 on your board. The black king is in checkmate because the three pawns on f7, g7 and h7 prevent the king from escaping from the check by the white rook. This is called a back rank checkmate, and it arises a surprising number of times in actual games. After turning off the cassette, set up diagram 18 on your board and see if you can see how white can use the idea of a back rank mate to finish the game. Black seems to be putting white under a lot of pressure, and white certainly can't play rook a1 takes a2, as black will be the one finishing the game with a back rank mate after queen c2 takes b1 checkmate. The white king has no escape from this check. Instead, white plays queen f3 takes a8 check. Black must reply rook a2 takes a8, and white wins the game playing rook a1 takes a8 checkmate. Here we have a two-move combination that leads to a back rank mate. I hope you found this finish to the game. Probably the most difficult part of such a combination is seeing the final checkmate. But if you already know about the back rank mate, the whole thing becomes easier. Keep an eye open for this possibility in your own games. The second checkmate that is worth knowing about is called the smothered mate. This arises when a king is left with no room to move and finds itself checked by a knight, as shown in diagram 19. The knight check can never be blocked, and as the knight cannot be captured and the black king has no escape square, the black king is in checkmate, smothered by his own men. Set up diagram 20 on your board and see if you can find a smothered mate for black. You can probably see that the first ingredient of a smothered mate, namely the king with no room to move, has occurred in this position. Black would like to play knight h5 to g3 checkmate, but isn't the white h-pawn protecting that square? No, once black moves his knight to g3, the black rook on h8 pins the pawn on h2 against the white king. Therefore, knight h5 to g3 is checkmate. A nice finish using the tactical pin and the smothered mate. Now let's put the black rook on g8 instead of h8. Can you see a way black can finish the game quickly now? This is a little more difficult, but if you understood the back rank mate and the smothered mate, you should find the solution without too much trouble. Black starts by playing knight h5 to g3 check. The white king is smothered, so white must reply h2 takes g3. Black has sacrificed his knight for good reason, as white now has his king stuck on the h-file with no protection and no escape square. Black can finish the game with rook g8 to h8 checkmate, a typical back rank mate, even though it occurs along a file. My objective in this section has been to show you that being able to find winning combinations is made much easier if you know of a checkmate that you can aim for in certain types of positions. Conclusion. In this cassette, I have dealt with many of the tactical weapons that occur in chess, and looked at the sacrifice and combination that can finish the game. Use the pin, skewer, fork, and discovered attack, and you will win material more easily than with a single threat. Chess tactics is the double attack. I would also recommend you experiment with the sacrifice. Remember, when you sacrifice material, you must get something in compensation.